Tipu Sultan, the Tiger of Mysore, 1753 to 1799. Tipu Sultan was a man evidently destined to struggle against adverse circumstances. Inheriting a great position from his father, he found that mysterious causes were hindering him from maintaining that position by the methods which his father had employed with striking success. And despite all his efforts to retrieve his situation, to reorganize his kingdom, and to set off power against power, he perished in a vain endeavor to preserve his independence of the new political forces, which had gathered such weight and momentum even during his own lifetime. Nor was he unlucky only in the circumstances of his career. He has been unlucky in his historians. Many men have defied the evident will of the gods, and yet received the admiration of humanity for the heroism of their struggle. But Tipu Sultan has been commemorated by Muslim chroniclers of the old school, following the traditional ways and seeking to glorify him as a martyred champion of Islam, the steadfast enemy of the infidel, no matter whether Hindu or English, or by English writers who naturally regarded him as the obstinate enemy of their own people, and reckoned his fall as the culmination of their triumphs in southern India. The first show him as the indifferent and unsympathetic master of his Hindu subjects. The second ascribed to the faults of his character and intelligence the failure of his political management. A truer estimate may perhaps be reached by recollecting that he was surrounded by forces which he could not analyze or even evaluate, and that therefore his efforts were necessarily blind and almost inevitably fruitless. Tipu Sultan succeeded at the close of 1782 to the power of his great father, Hyder Ali, in the midst of the Second War in the Carnatic. He was then 30 years of age and had already enjoyed considerable experience of both war and administration. He had taken a conspicuous part in the campaigns which had been in progress since 1781 against the East India Company, and had on more than one occasion displayed his fondness for swift movement and unexpected attack in the field. His education had been carefully attended to. He spoke and wrote Persian with ease and fluency. He was a practiced horseman, incessantly in the saddle. At the moment of his father's death, which occurred in the Mysorean camp near Arcot, Tipu was engaged in repelling the advance of a body of English troops, which had landed on the Malabar coast. His position was embarrassing. He had to choose between continuing his Malabar campaign or hastening eastwards to take over the charge of the kingdom. At Arcot was his younger brother, whom malcontents might easily attempt to set up as Hyder's successor. If that happened, then Tipu would be confronted by a war of succession as well as by a foreign war. He was forced therefore to quit his campaign in Malabar and hurry across the peninsula to take personal command of the army in the Carnatic. Fortunately, almost all Hyder's chief officers faithfully held to the declared wish of their late master. Tipu arrived and assumed with the command of the army the government of Mysore. The conduct of the war was the foremost problem before him. Already the position was beginning to be less unfavorable to the English. Warren Hastings' insight and fortitude had brought Mahadaji Rao Scindia to make the Treaty of Salbai, by which the Anglo-Maratha War was brought to a practical, though not immediately to a formal conclusion. Thus resources were freed by which Hastings' plan of attacking the Mysore territories on the Malabar coast might be carried into more effective operation than had been possible earlier. The change involved a certain loss of initiative on the part of Tipu, whereas Hyder in the Carnatic had been free to accept or refuse battle. Tipu had no choice but to seek out and destroy the invaders of his territory. The region was moreover that in which Tipu's power was least consolidated. The numerous petty chiefs who had recently been reduced to submission were naturally restless and discontented and ready to afford help to any invader. An expedition from Bombay had therefore small difficulty in landing and seizing a couple of seaports and invading the province of Bednoor, where they speedily occupied the capital. With swift decision, Tipu moved against this unexpected and indeed dangerous thrust at a vulnerable point. Fortunately for him, the English expedition was ill commanded. It had been entrusted to a company's officer, General Matthews, who was in himself overconfident of success, and who moreover was hampered by the jealousy of the king's officer serving under him. Tipu succeeded in surprising the English before they had concentrated to meet him, and quickly recovered Bednoor. He then laid siege to Mangalore in order to complete their expulsion from the territory. To aid in this affair, he had brought with him a detachment of his French allies under the command of an officer named Cosigny, and he had expected considerable aid in the siege operations from the skill of French engineers. But while the siege was still in progress, orders came from the Coromandel coast, where was the main body of the French forces, announcing that the preliminaries of peace between France and England had been signed in Europe, and directing the French with Tipu to desist from acting against the English. This meant not only the neutralization of Tipu's French contingent at Mangalore, but also that the English forces in the south were set free to act against his southern provinces. Luckily, the governor and council at Madras were little inspired by Warren Hastings' principle of seeking peace by making war terrible to the enemy. They were undoubtedly in need of peace, though not quite so acutely as they thought they were. They were also in great difficulties owing to internal disputes with the Nawab of Erkot, with their own military officers, and with the government of Bengal. They resolved, therefore, after a brief interval, to seek peace by negotiation rather than by pressing their advantages in the south. The proposal was far from unwelcome to Tipu himself. He needed peace in order to carry into effect his plans for reorganizing his kingdom. But he also felt sure that in policy he ought to carry the siege of Bangalore to a successful conclusion. Were it only to confuse the Malabar chiefs, that they had nothing to hope from intriguing with the English. He therefore agreed to receive the proposed mission, but took care that it should move so slowly through his territories that he would be in possession of the besieged palace before their arrival. The Treaty of Mangalore was signed on March 11, 1784. Tipu's treatment of the mission has long been the object of peculiar misrepresentation. The story ran that it was subjected to extraordinary indignities, that the commissioners were in danger of their lives, that gibbets were erected opposite their tent doors, that they attempted to escape to the British vessels lying off Mangalore, and that the treaty was negotiated and signed tender duress. The facts were very different. In the course of the siege, Tipu had discovered a correspondence going on between Colonel Campbell, who commanded in Mangalore, and Muhammad Ali, an officer high in the Mysore service. The details are unknown, but Campbell regarded the intrigue as securing one half of the Nabob's army to her side and bidding fair for the returning of the present government. The discovery of the plot had led to the execution of a number of persons believed to have been concerned. Tipu had hanged them on giblets, set up on the high ground surrounding Mangalore, presumably in order that the English garrison might see what had become of their promised friends. When the English ambassadors arrived, they desired their tents to be pitched on an eminence from which they could communicate by signal with the ships in the roads. Although they did not choose a spot closely adjacent to any of the giblets, it seems that from the shipping their tents did appear to be close to these memorials of Tipu's justice. Hence, in the excited state of men's minds, a story which spread to Bombay and thence to Calcutta to find prominent record in the pages of Colonel Wicks. Another matter of the same kind is afforded by the alleged treatment of the English prisoners in Mysore. They are represented to have been treated with extraordinary severity. Many are said to have been forcibly converted to Islam, many others put to death, and a large number detained in slavery after the conclusion of the treaty, which stipulated for the release of all prisoners of war. In this respect, too, there was evidently misunderstanding and misrepresentation. Normally, between two European nations, the private soldiers taken prisoners in war were put in confinement, but the officers would only be imprisoned if they refused to give their parole, not to attempt to escape. That was not the established Indian custom. The prisoners taken by Hyder and Tipu were all imprisoned, and though officers and privates were generally separated, the case of the officers at all events was much harder than it would have been in Europe. Again, attempts to escape led to prisoners being placed in irons, a great hardship indeed, but perhaps the only way in which the prisoners could be securely kept. The allowance made to them for food was small. Altogether, there can be no doubt but that their lot was very miserable. But this is as far as one can truthfully go. The standards of the time considered, they were treated severely, not barbarously. The severity of treatment led to a high mortality among those whose constitutions were unable to resist the depressing conditions in which they had to live. But this is a very different thing from the deliberate massacres of prisoners with which contemporary English opinion charged Tipu Sultan. No evidence survives which confirms that opinion. The case is much the same as regards the conversion to Islam. Among the private soldiers, a miserable confinement might well induce a certain number to be willing to exchange their religion for liberty, even at the cost of circumcision and a foreign service from which they could never return. Tipu, moreover, was certainly anxious to recruit such men as might be useful either as artificers in equipping or as instructors in training his army. His gaolers were not wanting in offering inducements such as good pay and easy employment to those willing to embrace Islam. There is no reason to believe that there were any converts other than those who elected thus to purchase their freedom. The case of those prisoners detained in Mysore after the peace almost certainly follows out the facts regarding conversion. A convert to Islam would necessarily be regarded not merely as having abandoned his former faith, but also as having accepted the sovereignty of the Sultan and having renounced his British allegiance. The Sultan would not regard such men as prisoners of war. They had ceased to be so, and it may be argued quite reasonably that he never understood the clause in the treaty stipulating for the surrender of prisoners of war, as including men who had become his subjects. But if the Treaty of Mangalore was not so humiliating and its execution not so evasive as has been supposed, so also it was a truce rather than a settlement. It certainly left Tipu Sultan with the belief that he could meet the armies and negotiators of the East India Company on equal terms. Nor was he favorably impressed by the past unsteadiness of the company's policy. He did not realize that in great part this was due to the defective organization, which had left the management of external policy in the hands of three separate authorities at Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta, respectively. He failed to understand that this was the major cause why he and his father had twice been able to ravage the Carnatic and defy its English protectors. He fell into the grievous error of underestimating the power of his late enemy and believed that with a trifle of good political management he could overthrow them altogether. In this belief, he was certainly encouraged by the French, who, though not prepared at once to renew their efforts to dominate India, earnestly hoped that the next war in Europe would enable them to do so, and used every effort to keep alive every spark of hostility to the English at every court in India. But this evident intimacy with Pondicherry inevitably made Tipu's policy suspect in English eyes. Nor was their suspicion weakened by the fact that Tipu controlled a great stretch of the western seaboard, and so might receive support and assistance from the French. He was destined to receive none, but even if he could have looked into the future and seen how slender was the actual aid he was to receive from the French, it may well be doubted if his conduct would have been materially changed. His mind was too active, his nature too independent, for him ever to have been willing to sink into subordination to another power. These qualities are clearly to be seen in the projects for internal reorganization, which mark his reign and which must be regarded as, in the main, his own work. Within the scope of his vision, he was a realist. For example, under Hyder Ali, the coin of Mysore had borne the name and titles of Shah Alam, the Delhi emperor. This was, of course, no more than a polite make believe. The English were doing and for many years continued to do the same in Bengal. Early in 1786, when on the verge of war with his northern neighbors, the Marathas, Tipu resolved to abandon this practice. He assumed the title of Padshah. He caused his own name to be inserted in the Friday prayers in all the mosques of Mysore and ordered a new coinage to be struck and issued bearing his own name and title. As he himself wrote with complete truth, Shah Alam was the prisoner of Sindhia and could be deemed a sovereign by none but idiots. Again, he was extensively busied with drawing up a code of regulations for the guidance of his officials. He abolished the Islamic calendar with its lunar year, so inconvenient administratively, since the harvest and the periods of assessing and collecting the revenue had to follow the courses of the sun. He drew up a series of revenue instructions, largely embodying the traditional usage of the country. He prepared a body of commercial regulations, many of which seem to anticipate the policy of self sufficiency which has been adopted as an economic ideal by many modern states. He discouraged foreign trade, except that portion of it conducted by his officials for the profit of the state. He set up a board of 9 persons to conduct this, and invited his subjects to participate by a method of deposits, on which a share of the profit was to accrue to the subscribers. He endeavored to abolish the local bankers, to take over their functions of internal remittance, and to substitute state money changers for the shroffs, who still then had driven a profitable trade in every bazaar. Wilkes is much inclined to turn all this to ridicule, but that is absurd. In some of these matters, Tipu was following in the wake of Akbar. In others, he was seeking, so far as he understood it, to follow the example of the East India Company. He was the first Indian sovereign to seek to apply Western methods to his administration. That the effort was unsuccessful is neither here nor there. Tipu had to meet two great difficulties. He did not really understand the principles which he was seeking to apply, and could not command the services of officials who understood them. But his mind was evidently alert, and he was eager to learn by experiment. Nor was his treatment of his Hindu subjects what Wilkes had described. In the historical sketches of southern India, we read of mass circumcisions, of the destruction of temples, the confiscation of temple lands. But Dr. Sen has shown that on occasion Tipu championed the cause of the Hindus and reaches the sound conclusion that where Tipu used severity, his motive was political and not religious. In fact, a rational consideration of his career shows him not the bigoted tyrant of tradition, but an active, enterprising man, moving in a world in which new forces had recently been let loose. Forces beyond his control, and to some extent beyond his comprehension. What conclusions, for instance, could Tipu Sultan or any other Indian prince of this day draw from the passing of the India Act and the appointment of Cornwallis as Governor General of Bengal? Yet they marked a change that was to be of decisive influence upon his fate. They meant that at Calcutta would govern one man with a control over English policy, and English power in India as complete as that exercised by an Indian prince. And because his organization was much more strongly knit, incomparably more efficient, the third war between the Muslim rulers of Mysore and the East India Company proves how completely and inevitably Tipu misread the portents of the time. He was eager to complete his control of the Malabar coast by the conquest of Travancore. The Raja had been seeking to strengthen his northern frontier by the purchase of certain fortresses, which had long been in the possession of the Dutch and which the Dutch had conquered from the Portuguese. A complication lay in the fact that the Raja of Travancore was declared to be an ally of the East India Company by the Treaty of Mangalore. But Tipu almost certainly knew that the governor of Madras was averse to acting in defense of Travancore. For that reason, perhaps, he decided upon the attack, supporting that the authority of the company was lodged in the governor, but it was not. The governor was suspended, another took his place. Cornwallis was resolute to defend his Hindu ally, and the Third Mysore War ensued. In both the former contexts, Tipu's northern neighbors, the Marathas and the Nizam, had been either neutral or hostile to the company. But Cornwallis swiftly concluded alliances with each, so that for the first time in a war with the English, Tipu had to defend his northern frontier. Nor was that the only fundamental change. When at the outset, Tipu's rapidity of movement checked and constricted the English attack. Cornwallis came down in person from Calcutta, assumed the direction of the war, penetrated into Mysore, captured Bangalore, and laid siege to Seringapatam itself. The outcome was the Treaty of 1793, by which Tipu was obliged to pay a heavy indemnity and sacrifice a large part of the additions which he and his father had made to the Mysore territory. This severe setback led Tipu closely to consider the ways and means by which his position might be restored. He could not meet the combined attack of the Triple Alliance which Cornwallis had formed against him. The Nizam perhaps counted for little, but the Marathas must not join the English again, and might not the French be brought in to set right the balance? He had already sent one embassy to Paris, and although he had got out of it little save a few French artificers and plenty of kind words, war had now broken out between the French and English. A second embassy went therefore to the new revolutionary government. The numerous Frenchmen in his service were allowed to form a revolutionary club. Tipu himself patronized it. Citoyen Tipu, the Frenchmen called him. He was in close and regular correspondence with Pondicherry. He sent a mission to the governor of Mauritius, seeking French recruits, and the governor recklessly put out a proclamation inviting all zealous French subjects who could be spared to join Tipu and drive the English out of India. These steps were taken in 1798. At almost the same moment there arrived in India a new Governor General, Richard Wellesley. He learned of this Mauritius proclamation of the arrival at Mangalore of a small number of French recruits and of Napoleon's invasion of Egypt. In his eyes, the question of Mysore must be settled before any considerable French expedition could reach India. He persuaded the Nizam to dismiss his French brigades and accept instead a body of the company's troops. That settled, He invited Tipu to enter into an alliance with the company. Tipu sought to lag the negotiations into those elaborate byways beloved of statesmen who are playing for time, but Wesley would admit of no delays. He reckoned that no French force could reach India before the middle of May 1799. At the close of 1798, he had gone down to Madras in order to have complete control of the situation. In January, he dispatched an ultimatum. Tipu sought refuge in a hunting expedition and returned no answer. Then again, Mysore was invaded by the company's troops. Their movements from Bombay by way of the Malabar coast, from Hyderabad, and from Madras converged on the capital. Their instructions were to concentrate on Seringapatam without delay. If Tipu officers battle, fight, and march on, if he seeks negotiation, receive his envoys, discuss his proposals, offer him terms, but march on. In April, the siege of Seringapatam was formed. On March 2, the defenses of the city were stormed, and Tipu was slain by a chance shot in the conflict. In this final struggle, he was clearly outmaneuvered, outgeneraled, outclassed. He might still have found safety in an agreement only a little more onerous than that which Ranjit Singh chose to accept a few years later. But he did not desire mere safety. He was too proud. He could not see the danger of his position. Which of the two, Tipu Sultan or Richard Wesley, could best estimate the probability of French assistance coming by a specified time. Moreover, the English supremacy on the high seas made a policy of hostility fatal to those Indian states that adopted it. Tipu, in fact, was caught in the interaction of forces which he could not appraise. But what really led him to his downfall were his own qualities, his bold spirit, his persistent and unwavering hostility to the fast rising power of the East India Company. A less resolute and adventurous ruler might well have saved his throne and dynasty.